Welcome to Season 2, Episode 6 of Community is a Verb. My name is Connor Kaysen, your co-host here at CIAV. And next to me, via the powers of the internet, is my dashing co-host, Mr. Well-Traveled. How you doing today?
I'm doing well, thank you. So dashing, that's the new one. I haven't heard that. So I like that. I appreciate
one of my early memories of you, Mr. Well-Traveled, when we first started hanging out in person, is you were just always... You presented yourself so well all the time. You just always looked so clean and well kept. And I'm not really like a clean, well kept kind of person. Like I'm a t-shirt and pants and tennis shoes kind of person. And so I always kind of look at you as this high standard of just being a well kept gentleman.
Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate that. That's very, very kind of you to say. I don't necessarily feel that way these days. I don't dress up anymore. I don't go anywhere. So, but thank you. That's very kind. Well, how are you?
I'm doing great. I mean, it's been a crazy week, right? Another crazy week in the world. Well, a lot happened, and that's kind of the focus of this week's show. And so I want to pass it off to you. How about you give us a little rundown on what we're going to talk about today?
Yeah, so this week we'll talk about the trending hashtag Stop Asian Hate. And I was really interested in having this discussion with you because, I noticed it a lot on my Instagram feed this week. And I thought to myself, this is a topic we haven't covered before. There definitely has been a rise in Asian hate crimes since the start of the pandemic. And in this week in particular, there was a mass shooting in Atlanta that I think just impacted us all.
America was rocked by another mass killing this week when at least 8 people were killed in shootings at 3 massage parlors in Atlanta.
The suspect in the deadly Atlanta area shooting spree telling police he was motivated by a sex addiction. 21-year-old Robert Long charged with killing 8 people in 3 separate massage parlors last night, 6 of them Asian women. Long telling police, though, that race was not a factor.
He claims that these, and as the chief said, this is still early, but he does claim that it was not racially motivated. He apparently has an issue, what he considers a sex addiction, and sees these locations as something that allows him to go to these places, and it's a temptation for him that he wanted to eliminate.
We should be treating hate crimes as such, and make no mistake, these women were targeted on the basis of their race. Some of these incidents were not treated as hate crimes, and that's unacceptable. The people in the Asian American community know that we are being targeted.
When you saw that, what were your first thoughts?
I mean, it was just scary. One of the first things, or not one of the first things, the later as we've been thinking about it and reading more about it is, what's really sad is I kind of got used to not seeing shootings in America. And it felt like this last year, there was just a lot less shootings. And to see it again is just like a heartbreaking thing of a turn of reality of the pandemic slowly coming to an end and everyone kind of hopefully returning back to reality. And then this happens and it's so sad and terrible. And to see it just be at different places, like this punk, like really intentionally went to these different places and shot his guns. It's just absolutely horrific and terrifying and incredibly traumatic for so many people. It was very sad to wake up, I think it was on Wednesday morning, and just start to see the outpouring of messages of people who are genuinely, who are just grieving about people they don't know, but they see themselves in these people who passed away, or they see their parents, or they see their friends. And that's incredibly sad. And so something to start off the show is I want to recognize the 8 people who passed away this week in the shooting in Atlanta. So I'll do my best to pronounce their names. But there's Delaina Ashley Wan, Paul Andre Michels, Xiaojie Tan, Daoyou Feng, Suncha Park, Hyun JungGrant, Suncha Kim, Yong and the one survivor who was shot is Elcias Hernandes Ortiz. And our hearts go out to all the families, all of the victims, everyone involved, their coworkers, right? Everyone in that community who is going to be dramatically impacted with this. Like, our hearts go out to those people who just can't imagine what it's like to be them right now, to go through this horrific event, this national news breaking event, and have to deal with their grief and their trauma while kind of the whole country is mourning this whole situation. It's just, it was really sad. And, I barely know how to express it. It's just a sad thing to see happen in America again.
Yeah, I agree with you. And in watching the news over the course of the week, for me, I was trying to understand what was being displayed, right? So there was a narrative that started with, this is an Asian hate crime. And then over the course of the week, you could see a very different sort of tug of war over this narrative that, well, was it really a hate crime? And so now there are folks who are debating what is a hate crime and who qualifies as a victim of a hate crime. And then you had news sources running with some of the remarks of, I believe it was an officer during a press conference who said the shooter just had a bad day. Yeah. And so you see all of these things and sort of this way of almost, I don't know, trying to qualify what happened in a way that's, well, it's not quite a hate crime, or maybe not qualified, maybe question what happened as, is it really a hate crime, or is it just that he had a bad day? Or I think there were other comments around his motive that seemed to question the nature of the type of crime. But if you look at this just on the face of it, it was a mass shooting. It was a planned attack, and the majority of the victims were Asian. And I think that's important. And the shooter was a white male, and I think that's important. I think also what it revealed, though, for many people, is that there are some inadequacies, right, in the law and in the way in which we talk about hate crimes. And Daniel Dae Kim, the actor that we know, testified before Congress this week. And he talked about not just the nature of these crimes, but the fact that these are not new, that they've been escalating. And there are a lot of other names we don't know, and there are a lot of other situations that haven't received as much attention. And he actually started his testimony with that.
Vicharatana Pakdi, murdered. Pak Ho, murdered. Noel Quintana, face slashed with a blade from ear to ear. An 89-year-old woman set on fire. Tadataka Ono, a professional jazz pianist, beaten so badly he can no longer play piano. And now 7 Asian people shot dead in Georgia 2 days ago, 6 of whom were women. These are only a few of the 3,800 reported incidents since last March.
So for me, when I heard the intro to Daniel Dae Kim's testimony, I think, just really moved and heartbroken by the severity of these attacks. I mean, there really were some very serious attacks that I had not heard about. And so it also makes me think about news coverage and whose stories are being told. Why hadn't I heard about those? Why weren't those all over the news in the past year? And I think it was a great way to remind folks that there's more to know, and we need to really elevate hate crimes in a different way to make sure that we have an opportunity to address them.
Yeah, I totally agree. One of the statistics I know he points out was from the Stop AAPI Hate National Report, was between March 19th and February 28th. So this isn't even including what's happened this month of March, which includes the shooting. But there were almost 3,800 reports of anti-Asian hate incidences in the country. A lot of them happening in California. I think almost half of those happened in California. And some statistics I looked specifically here in Seattle and King County alone prosecuted 59 hate crimes against Asian Americans in 2020, and that was a increase from 39 cases the year before. So I mean, almost double what happened this past year, which is just horrific, especially considering that the cities were shut down and so many people were inside and the social dynamics weren't happening. But also maybe that separation of people being inside created more of an opportunity for these hateful people to take advantage specifically of elderly people. And it's how do you not correlate the last 4 years political with the president and the words that were expressed dealing with coronavirus, and trying to place blame specifically on China for COVID-19 and how it spread across America, which we've just, in my opinion, handled so poorly. How we handled it had nothing to do with China. It was kind of our own fault on how we were dealing with this. And that has led to an increased problem here happening with these hate crimes. And I'm not really sure where I'm going with this, but 3,800 reported incidences. How many happened that weren't reported, right? Yeah. From things that were said to people. It's just, it's scary. It's extremely scary.
Yeah, I think that's what, if there's anything, I mean, there's nothing positive out of a situation like this, but if there's anything that we can take away is that we're not looking at hate crimes in the right way. We're not focused on them enough. And I'm appreciative for the organizations and the individuals who are stepping forward and making sure that we know. I think what's also hard for me though, when I hear numbers like that, right, that it doesn't allow me to really get a sense of who the people were, right? We hear the number, we hear the crime, we hear what type of incident either they happened to them or took their lives, and then they become reduced to a hashtag. They become reduced to a statistic. They become reduced to the way they died, not the way they lived. And oftentimes we don't even get a name. And so I appreciate that you took the time in our show to say the names of the victims of this week's mass shooting. I think that's probably the harder part for me, that I often wonder when I hear these numbers, who are the people who are behind these numbers? I know that they are people's parents and grandparents and friends and brothers and sisters and members of the community. So they have value, and I think that's part of recognizing their humanity, right? And we talk about these same issues when we talk about hate crimes against Black people or hate crimes against Latinos or immigrant groups, and I think sometimes that's what gets lost for me, and I want more of that. I want to also remember that individuals for who they are and with the life that they lived.
Yeah, I think you make a great point on both, just about how we are using our language to identify these situations. And saying it's a bad day is just horrific, right? Because it clearly wasn't just a bad day, right? That is covering up so much more. And it's important for whether it's two individuals like us or a conversation you're having with a friend, that you're a little bit more explicit with your language about hate crime in general, right? This was an attack specifically against a specific group of people because of their race. And you could say, moving forward, when you're having these conversations, whether it's their race or their religion or their sexual orientation, all those things, right, like contributed and are a major factor on why these attacks happened. And we got to be more explicit with these conversations, because I think having those conversations is how we create a better world, right? And how hopefully we can create change so things like these don't happen in the future.
Yeah, I agree with that. So Connor, this week I was on Instagram a lot, and I was on your page, and I got to see, that you were celebrating your 1 year anniversary, and so congratulations.
Thank you.
So this time last year, you were in Thailand, and you were getting married. It was an interesting thing to see that sort of the contrast, right? That this is a very happy and important moment in your life. And this was a really hard week for the Asian American community. How did that affect you this week and all of the things you wanted to do to celebrate?
Yeah. The contrast with what was happening, combining that with this Thai traditional wedding that I had last year was very interesting, just like dealing with the conflict. And specifically within my family, we had a lot of conversations this week, emotional conversations about, and it's been going since we got home from Thailand last March after the wedding. And I should say, for people listening, my wife is first generation American. Her mom is from Thailand. Her dad is also Chinese Malaysian. And so when we got back, there was just like an immediate concern of, oh, we're going to wear a mask to the grocery store. I don't want to be attacked because of what I look like because I'm wearing a mask. And this was before mask wearing was fairly normal, even here in Seattle. And that anxiety has been high for the entire year about like what's happening. And as each case has come out in each story, and we had a really bad one here in Seattle a couple of weeks ago where a man and woman were attacked with a stranger had a sock full of rocks and hit them in the face with the rocks and just attacked them in the international district. And so that happened a couple of weeks ago, and this all has been snowballing. And so there's just a lot of anxiety and fear and a lot of conversations between her and I about protecting ourselves, protecting her, making sure she feels comfortable. And it was sad. There was definitely a grieving process to see like what is going on. And I thought I went back and forth, like, do I share these images? Do I not? And in the end, I thought it was important to show that, it ended up working out well to show these beautiful images of a beautiful moment in our traditional Thai wear and having my Thai American wife and me being a white guy and kind of like how we combined our families, right? Which I think is just becoming more and more common to have these mixed race families. It's going to be normal. I can't in 30 years, it's just going to be the common thing. And so I thought it was good to, while we're having a lot of messages being shared about white supremacy, specifically against the Asian community, to show images of something beautiful and showing love and compassion and family coming together and combining those two sides. Because I think a lot, rightfully so, the narrative was splitting them apart right now. And so it was nice to share images of kind of going the opposite direction and showing like, hey, like there is still beautiful things happening between these two racial communities. And yeah, it was special. It definitely put an interesting light on the week, but I'm growing so much being married to her and experiencing all of these things. And back even last summer while we were going, while the Black Lives Matter protests were going on, there was so much conversation between her and I just about how she feels being a woman of color, the Asian community. There was lots of vandalism in the Seattle International District over the summer. Like the International District had more vandalism pretty much than any neighborhood than where else, just because they were vulnerable and they were attacked by people who just wanted to make damage. And so there's just been a lot of learning for me, having all these different conversations with lots of people, whether it's you, Mr. Well-Traveled, or with her, just learning different people's perspectives and seeing the world in a way that I hadn't seen before. And so I'm hoping there's definitely personal growth, and I'm hoping all these conversations help others grow as well.
Yeah, that's beautiful, actually. I'm I'm glad that you're doing well. I'm glad that your wife is doing well. I would like to say that I can imagine what it's like, but actually I know because, it's a very similar story to mine, right? Where I am always deeply affected every time I hear about violence against Black folks, particularly when there's, someone who's unarmed and shot by the police. I always think about, what if that's me? What if that's someone I know? It's very difficult. It's very stressful. So I think the best thing that we can do is to continue to have these conversations and to continue to support each other and really see the humanity in everyone, because we are not isolated in these incidents, right? These things, they happen to all of us. So I think that for me this week that's sort of what I was reflecting on, that this feels very familiar. I'm not Asian, but yes, I can see very clearly how it has the same root cause.
Yes.
And with that, I can understand and have great empathy for anyone who is feeling the stress, the anxiety, the frustration. I think, as we talked about it last year, it is the other virus that we live with every day, yes, right? We have our COVID-19 pandemic, but we also have a form of terrorism that we live with every day too. So our lives are busy, and sometimes we are only made aware when the most extreme case of violence rises to national news. But it's there every day, and it's happening to individuals. And to your point earlier, there are a lot of cases that don't get reported.
Yeah.
Perhaps more than actually get reported, right? And so it's really important that we start to focus more of our attention, as uncomfortable as it might be, on trying to identify ways to address hate in our world.
I totally agree. One of the silver linings that my reflections have been coming up on, especially thinking, like, Wednesday was the big day on social media that this whole thing popped, right? All the companies were posting, every individual was sharing the hashtag, and it's kind of inspired this conversation. And there was a lot of grief happening on Wednesday, and maybe one of the silver linings, which when that was all happening, it reminded me of what happened over the summer, right? Especially when you're in social media and you see all of this grief and these people that are struggling, people who are angry and want to see change. I don't want to say it's nice, because that's not the right word, but now reflecting on it, I think that it is positive change to see what happened over the summer helped all of these messages get out this week, right? And so there is some change of narrative of showing the importance of, when things happen like this, to getting out there and speaking about it, and getting people to understand and empathize who might not understand about what it's like to be someone else, right? Or to look different and live in this country. And so I think there is a sign of some progress, at least in a block of individuals who saw what happened over summer, saw those messages came out, felt empowered by what was happening in the community. And then something similar is happening now here. And I imagine that we are going to see more of moments or days like this that happen with other groups, marginalized groups specifically, to help elevate those voices and understand just a different perspective. And so I'm hoping that there's some positive gain that are going to come out of this. And I think when all these voices speak up and this pain is heard, it's going to be good for us in the end, at least for the people who listen. There was one more thing, Mr. World Travel. Yeah. Oh, go ahead if you had a thought.
No, go right ahead.
There's one more thing I thought it was important to bring up in this episode, and I didn't really talk to you about this before. But here in Seattle or the state of Washington, we have our own very dark history of how we have treated the Asian American population here specifically within our region. And I think it's so important to talk about with this show. And what that is spring 1942. This is just after the bombing of Pearl Harbor and our really entry into World War II. And president at that time was Roosevelt. He signed the Executive Order 9066. And pretty much what this was there was 100,000 people of Japanese ancestry forced to go into some type of internment camp, right? Because of the fear of them being spies for the Japanese government. And what is in Tacoma are the fairgrounds, which hosts the Washington State Fair, also known as the Puyallup Fair for people here locally. That fairgrounds was the location that was turned in what was called, which is a terrible name, called Camp Harmony. And Camp Harmony operated from April to October 1942, and almost 7,400 Japanese Americans lived in these shacks and horse stables, and just terrible living conditions to corral all of the Asian Americans. Pretty much if you qualified to go into one of these camps, you had to be 1/16 Japanese. And so after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt pretty much just said, if you're 1/6 Japanese, we're taking you and we're putting you in this camp because we don't trust you. And just an incredible injustice to Japanese Americans. And it was put like in this camp that we in Washington like celebrate as like our big state fair. And I just think it's really important to recognize the internment of Japanese Americans. This is now 60 years ago, but here locally, like in our community. And what happened was they would be put in Camp Harmony, and then they'd be shipped out to some of the bigger camps that were in California, Idaho, and Wyoming. And just like an ugly, ugly mark in our history. I want to give a shout out to one of our listeners, Wendy Cato. She really educated me on this whole situation. I know she knows a lot about the history and is always sharing about it. And I've learned so much from sharing her. So thank you very much, Wendy, for just continue putting that out. And I thought it was important to share here. Like, you know, we have all of these justice messages going out, but we are not guiltless in what we've done as a society towards Asian Americans. And our history is also extremely dark on how we treated those people.
So thank you for sharing that. I did not know that history. I'm sitting here just at a loss for words because I had no idea that that's how the state fairgrounds were used in Washington State. I've only ever heard about the big state fair every year. And I think, you know, you and I have once had a conversation, I think maybe via text, around monuments, right?
Yes.
And this is the type of thing, right? We decide we create monuments, and we decide we create monuments in our society, or we decide where we're going to make sure that we remind people of history in our society in different ways. It could be a placard, it could be, you know, an actual museum or a program. And I recognize that is lost in our society for a number of reasons, but it's something that we need to be reminded of, not simply because it certainly could happen again if we're not reminded of it, but also because that is something that, you know, if I'm thinking about, you know, a plantation, for example, that's not a place that I want to hang out, because I understand the history, and specifically as it relates to my ancestors. And I think if I didn't know, I would be in an environment, right, that would make me uncomfortable. And I would want to acknowledge at least the history if I'm going to go to a place like that. And I've never been there, but I think that's important. And I appreciate Wendy, for one, always being a listener who shares a post of every time she listens to an episode, she posts about us. And I appreciate that. But also the fact that she's a listener who's also influencing our conversation and influencing our show. That, for me, is exactly why we do this. And it's exactly why you and I have been having these conversations we've had conversations for a while, but since we started this show, this is really the point. And it's about bringing people together. It's about having really important conversations. We have fun too, but it's also about really being forces for positive change through conversation. And that has always been something I've appreciated about the fact that we are friends, and that there's an extended now community around that. And so thanks, Wendy. And thank you, Connor, for taking the time to educate me and educate our audience.
Yeah, I'll link another article as well in the notes if anyone's curious about diving more into that. But that's Executive Order 9066 if you're looking to Google it.
So with that as a thought, education definitely is one thing that we have the opportunity to do. We can educate ourselves, and oftentimes after these big incidents, we hear a lot about what are we going to do? What's next? And we talk a lot about solidarity. Solidarity is good, but we also need solutions. We also need to take action as individuals and collectively. So educating yourself, increasing your knowledge, that's certainly something you can do as an individual. But I also know that donations to the right organizations matter too. We've talked a lot about that. And hashtag activism is one piece, but there's also the social action portion. And we know that within that, we are more powerful as a collective. Something I also noticed on your Instagram feed this week, you made a donation to an organization. I was wondering if you would be willing to tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, one of the surprises that I noticed was it wasn't actually very easy to find organizations that were fighting against this cause. I was a little surprised by that at first, especially trying to because I wanted to donate something locally, and I was struggling to find where those pieces were. As time's gone on, there's definitely been more came out, but where I made my donation at the time was to stopAAPIHate.org. And they are based out of California, and their community stands. Here's their message: our community stand united against racism. Hate against Asian American Pacific Islander communities has risen during the COVID-19 pandemic, and together we can stop it. And they are distributing their resources to lots of different places, whether it's education or activism, to address this issue. And so I donated this organization because it stuck out to me, and I thought when I read that a lot of these attacks were actually happening in California, it was like 45% of that 3,800 were in California. It shifted my mind. It was like, I want to put some of my resources in that direction, just to help out. And then some of the other things that I think I would recommend, or that I'm doing, I'm always a big advocate. Go support those businesses that represent those individuals, because that is my community 100%. So that's going to the International District and putting your dollars towards those businesses. They've needed it for the past year. So that is always a simple way that you can help out those communities. The other thing is, I think having these conversations are so important. And the big thing, there's two things. One is reaching out specifically in this situation to your Asian friends and at least let them know that you're thinking about them, right? You don't need to necessarily be a place for them to express their grief. They might not be comfortable doing that. That might not be the right way, but reach out to them. Let them know that you're thinking about them, that you care for them. And if there is something that you can do for them, be there for them, because they definitely need you in this time. But also be reaching out to your white friends, and specifically if you look more like me, and having these conversations too, right? Because from a lot of these conversations we have, we know that the white community needs to take a lot of responsibility for making the change, right? Because the white supremacists, however many degrees of separation they are from someone like me, the conversations I have with those degrees away trickle down eventually, right? And it is brutal to say, but someone who looks like you is not going to change the white supremacist mind, right? Like, very rarely that conversation is going to have. So where the conversation needs to be had are people who look like me between each other saying we need to speak up when we hear these things. And I have experienced this year in my family directly with hateful things that were said that weren't directly hateful, but they were ignorant to say in relation to my wife and now my family and their race. And those, you need to speak up on those things, right? I have learned a lot of lessons about how do I communicate those things to my family when they say things that are inappropriate, that I think are mostly based out of ignorance, not necessarily hate. But I'm learning to maybe not address those situations with anger like I did early on, and having more mature conversations about why that's not appropriate, why that affects people. And I've seen when it affects people within your direct circle, usually those messages are heard. And it's those small little changes which make a difference, right? Because those people take those learning lessons and they pass it on whenever they encounter a scenario like that, whether in the workplace or out in public society. And having those little conversations are really, I think, important to create change.
You said that beautifully. That couldn't have been said any better. I mean, so I don't have anything else to say beyond that, other than I appreciate that message. I thank you for speaking up in that way. So yeah, sounds good.
Thank you. I mean, yeah, it's been quite the growth journey just for me, right? And that's why this show is sometimes stressed me out. Like I was nervous about coming to comment like this. When we have these heavy topics, it's like, okay, like you really got to try to put your ego aside and really like dive deep to see what the problem is. I mean, but that's why I enjoy doing this show, is to kind of like unpeel some of those layers, right? There's the same reason why I thought it was good to post about my wife and I and put our images up there together. Same reason why I like doing the show with you, right? Like to have these conversations that are not easy and not fun, but require a level of self-identification and understanding, and just to get up here and say it. And so I appreciate you just listening and being supportive.
Absolutely. Well, I know there's more that we could talk about today, and probably we will. I wanted to ask you, normally ask me if there's anything that any final words, anything to end on. But honestly, this is one of those episodes where I don't know that I have any real words, because we are unfortunately going to have to keep having this conversation, yes. Which is what I said about last summer when we got started with this podcast, that we will be having this conversation over and over and over again, and until we can get to a place where we're really addressing hate in our world. And we're very far from that place, unfortunately. So as much as the tendency in our culture is to end on a positive note, I think the positive note maybe for me right now is to say this is about culture change. I mean, everything that we're talking about is about culture change. And what you've identified really is a systemic way to do that on an interpersonal level, that you are going to have these personal conversations and be very conscious of your own biases, but then also and finding ways to address that for yourself, but then finding ways to address that with people within your life. And that is constant work. It is stressful. It is hard. It takes a lot of time. It is not fun. But that is how we change the culture. That is how we recognize the humanity in people in our culture, and define what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. And I think most of us are pretty clear that what happened this week, what's been going on over the last year, is not acceptable. And now it's about what are we going to do about that to make an change for a more positive future. I do think a lot about that as well. I think a lot about the future and about what future generations will look back and say about the time that we lived in and what we have tried to do. So my hope here is that us having this conversation today and all of the millions of people around the world who are talking about change that they would like to see, that we will take those next steps to address the changes that we would like to see in leadership, in our laws, in our social structures, and as well as in our communities and our relationships. So that's my thought. So here's my question. So how would you like to, do you have any last thoughts as we wrap the show today?
Yeah. These conversations are really difficult to have. I understand 100% about going through them, and it's going to be challenging for every person. The part that I keep coming back to is, especially, let's take this from my white perspective, and to anyone who's white who's listening and are struggling to have these conversations. These conversations are not as hard to have as it is to look like someone like Mr. Well-Traveled and go out and deal with them directly to their face and deal with the direct hate towards their face, right? Like, it's not as hard as that. And so anytime I'm struggling to kind of move forward, I just think about, like, I'm having a conversation, and a lot of these conversations are about being helpful and kind of bringing people together. It's not the fear of going out and dealing with that, because I don't deal with that fear for the most part. And so that's always the thing I think about to kind of like shift my perspective on, like, it's not so bad to have these conversations. It's going to do good. Was there a book you wanted to shout out? So on my timeline this week, there is a PhD I follow, and I noticed that he posted a book, one that I'm interested in reading. It's called The Making of Asian America by Erica Lee, and it's a history book. I haven't purchased it yet, so I don't know much about it, but there were some passages that he posted that really spoke to me, and it talked about the Trans-Pacific slave trade. And within that really got my attention, because he highlighted that section and he said, who knows about this? Who learns about this in school? Who talks about this? And that really got my attention, because as we've talked about on this show, and as we know in the world, that so much of what we are dealing with today traces back to a very specific point in time where colonization arrived in this part of the world, and the movement of people from Africa to this continent, not by their own choice, is the place where I could say we start with the majority of our social problems. And to not know, I think, about how history has influenced what is happening this week, for me, I felt like was a gap. And so when I saw this particular book being recommended, I thought to myself, this is one that I'm interested in, and I want to read. Maybe I'll get the audio book, because it's a pretty lengthy book. But I think part of the work that we all can do, as I mentioned before, is really taking time to learn more. And history teaches us a lot. So yeah. I always like to go with high quality historical literature. I will link that up in the show notes. So if you guys are interested, you can check that out. Well, Mr. Well-Traveled, I think this is the conclusion of another wonderful episode. You can follow him at Mr. Well-Traveled on Instagram. I am at Find Me in Seattle on Instagram. We thank you so much. If you like this, interested, you have someone who might be interested, please share it with them. Leave us a review. Anything you can to support the show. We deeply appreciate it. Mr. Well-Traveled, I appreciate you. Tyree, who's the producer on the back end, we appreciate you so much, Tyree. Thank you very much. And thank you, everyone. We will see you in another 2 weeks for the next episode.